Okay, well, I would say that they can resist for many reasons. I think we cannot underestimate the amount of conflicting and disturbing information that floods clients 24/7, not only in the media age, but the social media age. So that what the financial professional is saying is literally a drop in the ocean of the flood of opinions and voices that the client is getting. The second thing I would say is people really make emotional decisions. They think they're making rational decisions, but they make emotional decisions. So very likely the resistance may be coming from a strong fear they want to avoid or a strong desire they want to get, and something about what the financial professional is saying is not helping them avoid that fear or not helping them get that thing they really want, and so they're feeling some resistance. The other thing is most people don't easily reveal their core emotional drivers. We will give all sorts of rational reasons why, and so the person may be speaking rationally and coming across as rational, but inside it's really coming from an emotional place. So it's a challenge for financial professionals to actually uncover the true source of that resistance. I had a client recently. She happens to be in a warehouse. She has a client who loves to listen to CNBC, and the client is always calling and saying, "Oh, I heard this, I heard this," and then my client has to walk through all the reasons why that is not a good plan for her, and and then the next week, "I heard this, I heard this." So she's having to kind of continue to bring her back to stay on track. My financial professionals, and I think many, vacillate between concern and frustration. They're
Okay.
concerned because they don't want the client to run their plan and their portfolio off the rails. And so they have a genuine interest in making sure their client stays on track. And that is mixed with frustration because as a professional, they have given that client the best advice they can. They are much more informed than the client is. And these random things the client hears are not related to the client's situation. And so I think they have this internal conflict of I'm concerned and I'm also frustrated. And depending on how often the client comes back wanting to get off track or be panicky or they're having to redirect them, the frustration goes up with every time the client has to be reminded. So it's, I think, hard for the financial professional to stay in the place of concern and empathy and not drift into the place of I'm frustrated and I'm annoyed. Why aren't you listening to me? So I hear both. I would differentiate how the client is inquiring.
Mhm.
So to me, there is a difference between a client who is talking to the financial professional with curiosity and calm and inquiring, tell me more about this. I want to understand this. I don't understand where we're going. I don't understand these details. What's the purpose of this? Questioning with a sense of curiosity and inquiry is not the same thing as being resistant.
Hmm.
So the first thing I would tell a financial professional is notice the tone of the client. If the client is inquiring into details with a sense of curiosity and wanting to learn, and it could even be a bit of skepticism because they don't understand, that is when you can say, lean it more into explanation. And the first thing I would say to the financial professional is don't launch on your long explanation immediately. Inquire what the person wants to know. So I hear Mr. and Mrs. Client, you're asking some questions. Before I go into a long explanation, tell me what is it that you would like to know that will help you feel more confident? What is it about what I've described that is unclear for you? And I can explain the areas that are important for you. I think very often professionals are sort of have a script in their head and they have all this knowledge in their head, and it's easy for them to sort of just Wikipedia out, and it's not as common for them to immediately ask a question versus immediately advise. So if the client tone is, I want to understand more information, and even if they're peppering them with questions, if it's not emotionally laden, then answer the questions with logic. If there's an emotionality to it, they're upset, they're worried, there's sort of a resistance, emotional resistance, then you've probably got an emotional core underneath the questions, and you want to find out the emotional core. So the emotional core is either going to be, I'm afraid of something, and or I'm not going to get something I really want. So it's either a desire drive or it's a fear drive. I think most humans are more driven by fear than desire, as we know from loss aversion. We want to avoid losses. So then the inquiry starts, but the inquiry starts from the financial professional from an emotional standpoint. So you want to ask an open-ended question that gets to the emotion. It would be like, well, I'm hearing, Mr. and Mrs. Client, that you're not quite sure. I'm noticing some hesitancy. Tell me, what about this plan? You know, is there something that's worrying you about this plan? Is there something that's worrying you about this advice? Is there something that's concerning you? Or is there something that's missing that you feel you wouldn't get what you wanted in the end based on where we're going? So I don't use the words goal because goal is in your head. Goal is not an emotion. Goal is a very practical, a cognitive thing. I want to get an A in my class. I want to graduate. I want to have X amount of money. It's not an emotional thing. So I would ask open-ended questions that get at, is there something that concerns you? Is something that worries you? Is there something that's missing that we're not getting what you want? I would use worry and want words because they're not as scary as what are you afraid of, but they get at the emotion. And so people are not, we live in a society that loves rationality. And so most people, unless they're in front of their therapist, are not going to say, I'm desperately afraid. But if you can get it, the worry, and you can get it, the want, it'll help them begin to reveal what's the emotional driver up underneath. So that's where I would go. What's the emotional driver underneath? And then once you deal with that, you can go forward. But if you immediately go to logic, they're going to not feel heard, and it's not going to address either their worry or their want. The better way is not to just do the math equation, because math doesn't solve the problems of the heart. And the better way, and it's not a way without effort, because the human brain is wired to avoid pain much more than it is to seek gain. This is the way we're wired. That's number one. That's loss aversion. We know that. Number two, the human being is happier staying in an uncomfortable present than into a vacuum of the future. So you've got that. The present is uncomfortable. I know I'm not doing the best, but I know what this present is about. If I step off a cliff, it might be even worse. So you got that thing going. That's two things going. The third thing you've got going is human beings are absolutely horrible, terrible at predicting how they're going to feel about their future. They just cannot imagine how they're going to feel 10 and 20 years down the road when they've sat in cash and all their friends have had a portfolio that went up by multitudes, and they're sitting there with their little piggy bank of the cash that was stuck under the mattress. They can't imagine how bad they will feel about that loss in the future because they're so focused on now. So the technique would be to flip the loss aversion into not regretting the loss that they're going to have in the future. So this is where they get to the advice professional gets to do the math equation with the idea of visualizing what that loss is going to be like. So for example, if Andrea sits in cash and the markets do what the markets do, Don't show the dang graph. The woman doesn't care about the dang graph. But if markets do what markets do and extrapolate it out far enough that the loss that Andrea is going to feel is going to be big. So I don't know, 10, 20 years, whatever makes sense. And you say, Andrea, if we stay with this strategy in this moment, 20 years from now, you will have lost X amount of dollars. Your peers who have gone into the market, get to use herding. Your peers who have gone back into market will be living this lifestyle and have these opportunities, and you will be looking back at this decision 20 years back, and you will now have this huge loss that is guaranteed, because we know if you sit here in cash, you will have no growth and you will have this experience. And here, and if you're going to do math, do the math in something that's concrete. Dollars in the bank. Nobody cares about graphs. They think of money. How much money do I have in the bank? Or opportunities. Go back to the financial plan. When you, 20 years from now or whatever, you want to be able to travel, you will have no travel budget. You will have wasted all that travel budget. You have lost all that travel budget. So you flip it into the future so they can see the regret and the loss of what they will experience in the future. And it takes some effort because we've got the three things that we're overcoming right now. But if imagine themselves in the future, and then you can say, you know, Andrea, what will you be saying to yourself now? If you're, when you're looking down the road 20 years from now, how are you going to think about that decision now when you're sitting there with all of that loss 20 years from now? If you can get people to put themselves in that future state, they'll look at themselves in the mirror, and Andrea, I'm not picking on you, and Andrea will say to herself, I will have to say I was really stupid. Like, I will have to look back at myself and say that was a really dumb decision. So it's putting them in that future state.
Barbara Kay is not affiliated with Hartford Funds.